All right. We are 2 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to get us going. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's July Science Seminar. I'm Jess Delfiaco. I'm the Communications Manager for the Midwest CASC. And I'm going to kick us off with just a couple of housekeeping items. One is that this webinar is being recorded, so please turn your cameras off and mute yourself while Anna is presenting. And then we are going to have Q&A towards the end of the hour today. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to pop those in the chat. And then at the very end, you're welcome to go camera on, ask your questions directly, or pop them in the chat, and we will get to them. With that, I'm going to hand things over to Alyssa.
Thanks, Jess. Make sure I'm off mute. Great. Okay. My name's Alyssa Welch. I am the program manager for the Midwest CASC based at the University of Minnesota. I am going to just say a few words about our Midwest CASC. Many of you have heard this background before, or you've interacted with us and you have experience with what we do already. But so welcome to returning folks and welcome to new folks joining us here today. So as a reminder, the Midwest CASC emphasizes our regional research collaborations and is a partnership between the USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, and a consortium of 8 institutions across our Midwest region. And we're based here at the host institution at University of Minnesota. We are part of a national network of regional CASCs, all of which work to produce science that seeks to inform research management efforts, helping fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. Our work and the research we support centers around a set of science priorities specific to our Midwest region. Each region has its own set of regional science priorities, and more information about our science priorities can be found on our website. But we accomplish this mission in several primary ways here in the Midwest, including conducting synthesis research on those regional science priorities. We support a network of graduate students and postdoc fellows to build capacity around climate adaptation research in the region. We partner with our consortium member College of Menominee Nation to offer a tribal REU research undergraduate research experience for undergraduates program. In fact, we were delighted to welcome the intern group and staff here to the Twin Cities last week to meet with our local interns. That was a great few days of events. We also host capacity building workshops and an annual gathering of our Midwest CASC community, which I'll say a little bit more about in a sec. And of course, we fund climate adaptation research projects and partnerships through the funding that comes from USGS throughout the consortium to PIs at the consortium and USGS and partners. All right, with that, our main announcement today is all about the annual gathering. So we have our annual gathering coming up this August 13th, 14th, and 15th. Thank you, partner Michigan State University, for hosting us in East Lansing this year. We are reaching capacity for our event. So if you haven't yet signed up, today is your day. We are also keeping a wait list. So if we're notified of any cancellations, and we exceed our target number, we hope to accommodate as many attendees as possible. So please do feel free to register. It is free to register, and we are grateful for our funding to be able to offer this as free. I'm also told that we have an extension on our room block at the Graduate in East Lansing until today. So if you've been holding out to reserve a hotel room and you know you're coming, visit the website in our logistics section to find information about our hotel block. And finally, I would say that if you are a student or postdoc specifically interested in attending the gathering, or if in general you'd like to learn more about the travel support that you may be eligible for, please do reach out to me. Again, more information on our website about that under our news and events tab, I believe. So I'm now going to hand it over to Jessica Hellman, who is our consortium director as well as executive director of our Institute on the Environment here on at the University of Minnesota, where the Midwest Cask is based. Let's go.
Thank you, Alyssa. Yay, very excited about our annual gathering next month. Something as soon as we ended the last one, we started talking about the next one, and it'll just be so wonderful to gather, to be in person, and to be in East Lansing, showcasing Michigan State University and the state of Michigan and all the extraordinary work that goes on there on climate adaptation science. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I have the great pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Anna Stockstad. But before I do, I'd like to say just a couple of words about the power of the organization that Anna represents, and that is University Extension. Many of you may know about University Extension. Extension programs work to bring university resources, expertise, training to communities across the state in service to the public and the mission of the university to help its state and its public thrive. Several of the Midwest Cask Consortium members, the University of Minnesota, the University of Illinois, Michigan State, the University of Wisconsin, we are all land-grant institutions, which mean we all have extension programs. Extension programs are really well suited to both pursue climate adaptation science and to convey it to communities across the Midwest. That's why Extension has been part of the University of Minnesota's leadership hosting of the cask from the get-go. And we are looking to thoughtfully deepen our engagement with Extension across the cask as a whole. So that's one of the reasons, among others, why we're so excited to have Anna here today. She's an exemplar of exactly the power of University Extension. Today, you're going to hear about a project that helps Minnesotans use climate adaptation management strategies to keep their forests healthy. But I'd like for everyone online to really do us a favor and maybe spend a little time as you listen thinking about extension work that you are familiar with, maybe you're part of, maybe you're an extension person yourself. But think about what kind of work is going on in your state, and please reach out to us if you have ideas about how extension work that you're knowledgeable of, how that might collaborate or connect with the Midwest Cask. And then we can take it from there. But we're eager to hear those ideas. So now about today's speaker, Anna Stockstad. Anna is an extension forester based at the Cloquet Regional Office here in Minnesota. She develops educational programs for woodland stewards focused on forest ecosystem health and climate adaptation. And she's the lead instructor for the Minnesota Woodland Steward Program. Just this morning, a bunch of us received an email saying that Anna is going to be moving into the leadership role for a group called the Midwest Forest Climate Working Group. So congrats on that, Anna. I follow that activity pretty closely myself. Anna's has expertise in forest soil science, ecosystem ecology, climate smart forestry, and she has both a master's and a bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota's Department of Forest Resources. So thank you, Anna, for sharing your work with us today, and the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and for the great introduction to what extension is and why extension is important. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and hopefully everything works. All right. Can you see my slides okay?
We can.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So again, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Anna Stockstad, and I'm really excited to be speaking to you all today about a new extension forestry program called Climate Ready Woodlands. And so this is a program that was initially launched last September, and it really has evolved over the last year. And I'll be going into those changes here in a few slides. But essentially, the goal of this program is to provide robust adaptation options to woodland stewards all across northern Minnesota, specifically related to species selection and thinking about what species they should or could retain on their landscape based off of climate projections, wildlife considerations, etc. There we go. Perfect. So I'd like to quickly shout out the Climate Ready Woodlands team as a whole. My colleague Angie Gupta was actually the one who was initially supposed to be giving this talk, but she's out supporting her son who's competing at a national soccer tournament, so I stepped in for her today. But Angie is also an extension forester, but based down in Rochester, and she works a lot with invasive species as well as with climate adaptation. I cover the northern part of the state. I'm based in Cloquet. I live in Duluth. And then Emily Dombeck is our Extension Forestry Program Coordinator based down in the Twin Cities. And this project really wouldn't have been possible without the three of us working together as a team. And so I just want to express my gratitude for both my team members here. So the plan for my talk today is I'm going to start first by laying out the context of the Climate Ready Woodlands program and how we got here to where we are today with this project. I'm going to talk about how we developed the program and the methodology that went into the specific recommendation lists that we created. I'm going to provide an example of some of these lists for a specific ecoregion, and I will preface here that we are in the process of updating the website and publishing these final lists. So the final versions aren't quite yet finalized and published, but I'm just going to be giving a quick snapshot of those lists today. And then I'm also going to be talking about how this program is expanding and what the next steps are going forward into the future. So the intended audience for this program are woodland stewards in Minnesota. And what do I mean when I say woodland stewards? So these are people that we could also call family woodland owners, private landowners, often families who own and care for woodlands all across Minnesota. And I do want to emphasize that ownership doesn't always mean stewardship. You don't have to own land in order to be a steward of the land. When I'm teaching programs, I'm often talking about how we're really just renting the land for a period of time. No one truly owns it. We're just caring for the woods in the time that we have with it. But looking at this framework of thinking about family woodland owners specifically, when we look at the data, in Minnesota, 33% of the forest land is owned by family woodland owners. So this equates to almost 5.4 million acres, and then the average property size is 53 acres. So this is a lot of folks who all have diverse goals, values, and management priorities. So we need to try to meet their education needs through extension forestry, trying to meet this huge group of landowners and caretakers of our woodlands and trying to meet these different diverse goals and values that they have. And so in 2020, Extension Forestry conducted a needs assessment, and this showed that these folks have a diversity of learning needs. And it's not so surprising which ones come out at the top, being woodland management and wildlife, but also climate change and how trees store carbon comes up here as well. But through the Climate Ready Woodlands program, we're trying to recognize that we need to go beyond just thinking about carbon, because adaptation is an act of caretaking for our woodlands, and climate change impacts every aspect of woodland stewardship. It impacts wildlife, it impacts timber production, invasive species, et cetera. So climate change is kind of something that touches upon every aspect of how these woodland stewards care for their forests, which is why it's important that we develop educational programs that meets the diverse needs of these different landowners. And especially when we're thinking about the large land base that is owned by woodland stewards in Minnesota and the fact that we are so lucky to have 4 different biomes here in the state, we need to really be keying in on forest adaptation specifically, especially thinking about folks in the northern part of the state and thinking about those species changes that are happening at the ecotone between the boreal forest and the eastern broadleaf forest. And so this really emphasizes the need for diverse adaptation recommendations and strategies for woodland stewards who maybe they want to help to retain all those iconic boreal species on their landscape. Maybe they want to diversify, try out some new species that may be climate adapted to the future. There are a lot of different adaptation needs from this audience. So especially when we look at the broader context of how the forests are changing in Minnesota, especially in the northern part of the state. And so we've really based this project around the idea of the climate adaptation spectrum of resistance, resilience, and transition. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this spectrum, but I'm just going to be walking through it really quickly just to give a quick summary to make sure we're all on the same page here. But when we talk about resistance, so starting on that left-hand side of the spectrum, we communicate resistance strategies as the idea of trying to improve the defenses of an ecosystem against future anticipated changes. So trying to buffer an ecosystem from the impacts of future climate change. So when we're working with woodland stewards, we ask them, what do you want your woodland to look like in 50 years, 100 years? Because that can help to inform their decisions related to climate adaptation. So for resistance strategies, that desired future condition would be relatively unchanged. We want to protect what we have now. And so an example of this, for example, could be creating climate refugia for vulnerable species along the North Shore, since Lake Superior does a great job of buffering that climate along the North Shore of Minnesota. So maybe these are species that are vulnerable to the future impacts of climate change. Maybe they're species that are threatened by a forest health risk that just need a little bit of extra protection in our help to retain them on the landscape and make sure that we are promoting the resilience of these unique species. Another important thing to communicate to woodland stewards through this program is the idea of risk. Every climate adaptation strategy is going to have a different level of risk that may change over time. And so with resistance strategies, risk could increase as time goes along. And this is because we're kind of pushing back against the impacts of climate change, trying to maintain current conditions as the climate continues to change. Then as we move over across the spectrum, thinking about resilience, here just trying to allow the ecosystem to tolerate a wider range of changing conditions, trying to help it bounce back after disturbances. And so again, going back to that desired future conditions, we want it to look pretty much the same as it does now, but we're okay with a small amount of change. We just want to help it tolerate that wider range of changing conditions. And so another example of this that's very common in northern Minnesota and that I talk about a lot is the idea of diversifying aspen stands, which we have a lot of, with more conifer and hardwood components just to improve the diversity and resilience of these stands. And then with resilience strategies, risk is going to go up and down over time, depending on how those conditions change, depending on the disturbances that occur, such as forest health threats, extreme weather events, etc. And then moving all the way over to the right side of the spectrum and thinking about transition. So when we're thinking about transition, this is the idea of trying to intentionally anticipate and facilitate change based on future projected climate change. And here, the desired future condition that some landowners may be interested in is going to be different than what we have now. So trying to change our current ecosystem to something that looks different than it does today. So a common example of this that I've actually seen woodland stewards implementing is planting swamp white oak in black ash stands, either in anticipation of emerald ash borer infestation or in response to a current EAB infestation. And then again, with risk here, risk is going to be highest when we're first starting out because we're maybe planting something that is adapted to a future condition, but not necessarily right now. And so when we're working with these woodland stewards, it's really important to emphasize the different levels of risk with our different climate adaptation strategies, but especially with transition, that you're going to have that highest risk when you're first starting out. So going through the different demographics of our woodland stewards in Minnesota and that climate adaptation spectrum, that really provides the context and the foundation for the Climate Ready Woodlands program. So we developed this program in the first place because we were really hearing demand for climate ready information, especially for small acreage landowners. These small acreage landowners are really looking for recommendations for how they can help their woodlands to adapt to a future climate. People are also really interested in how to care for pollinators and other species of wildlife in their woods. And so we recognized this need, and we added an additional layer of microfaunal benefits to this program. So that includes pollinators and other insects, small mammals, birds, etc., trying to add in that additional layer of information to meet these diverse needs of woodland stewards. And of course, people always ask us, what tree should I plant? And of course, the answer almost always is, well, it depends. But we're trying to provide more answers for species selection through this program. So hearing all these different needs, we created the Climate Ready Woodlands program. And so essentially, the Climate Ready Woodlands program covers the entire state, and we've broken the state into 11 different ecoregions. And once we have fully published this new version of the program online, which you'll be able to access at the Z link below, each ecoregion is going to have 3 different species lists. One is a climate capable tree species list. The second is species to consider for climate refugia. And then the third are native understory plants that are both climate resilient and provide those microfaunal benefits. And I'll go into the details of each of these lists in a few slides in this presentation. But I just want to communicate here that these are the core parts of the Climate Ready Woodlands program, are these 3 different recommendation lists to meet these different needs. And like I said, we are currently under construction. We're trying to get this new website and a lot of new narratives and content published on the website as soon as possible. So I do recommend, if you aren't already, that you subscribe to the Extension Forestry newsletter, which you can use the Z link here or the QR code in order to do that. And we'll be sending out updates related to this program here. So now going a little bit deeper into the process that's gotten us here today, since this has been an evolving program. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, we published this program, the version 1.0 in September of 2023, so almost a year ago, which is pretty crazy to think about. And now we have been working on updating the methodology, creating new and improved versions of the list based off of feedback that we've heard from our colleagues and from the actual users of these lists. And these are, so we developed these new updates in spring 2024. And now this summer, we are working on developing new website pages and narratives, preparing the content for final review with our colleagues and collaborators, and then working to get that new website published online and released as soon as possible. So this is where we are at right now with this program. Still in a little bit of change, but we're nearing version 2.0 of the Climate Ready Woodlands program, which is exciting. So now to get more into the details of program development and methodology, we had to make some assumptions and considerations when we were developing these lists. So first, these lists are developed using a model-based methodology. The data is derived from the USDA Forest Service Tree Atlas, climate suitability data, and the Minnesota DNR tree habitat response data. So since this is a model-based methodology, and it also includes forest health considerations, which I'll talk about in a second, but we always say, models are only as good as the inputs and the parameters that you use. So that's something that we just have to communicate to folks, is that we are using a model-based methodology here. And these lists specifically are recommendations, again, for those climate-ready tree and native plant species, as well as species to consider for refugia. And we also started this program around the idea of rewilding, and I'll include the definition of rewilding in the next slide. But essentially, the idea of rewilding is about promoting diversity, not only in tree species, but also in our understory plant species, which is going to help us to have better wildlife diversity, promote soil health, etc. So promoting diversity all across the ecosystem. And then these lists aren't going to be the right option for everyone. And that's because not every woodland steward is interested in climate adaptation. And so it's okay if these lists aren't of interest to every single woodland steward out there, but we are just trying to provide those options to woodland stewards who are interested in climate adaptation recommendations specifically. And these lists are always meant to be used in collaboration with a forester, because a lot of these decisions are really complex and site-specific, and we can't get that specific on the extension website when we're trying to meet all of these different information needs. So as I mentioned, this project is really rooted in the idea of rewilding, and I won't read the definition for you here, but it is included, and this is from Carver et al. 2021. But again, this is the idea of trying to promote diversity across the ecosystem, from trees to understory plants, wildlife, soil health, etc., so that we are creating resilient, self-sustaining ecosystems of the future, trying to think about, it's kind of like ecosystem restoration, but more forward thinking, and trying to create a future adapted ecosystem that's going to continue to be resilient going forward into the future with climate change. And so this is a big part of our programming when we're talking to woodland stewards, is really focusing in on the importance of diversity and how diversity creates stable, resilient ecosystems. And so this is a really basic but important concept to understand for woodland stewards, trying to have a diversity of tree species. And when we say diversity of trees, that means not only species, but also structural diversity, age diversity, etc. And then promoting our understory plants, microfauna, etc. And of course, since I'm a soil nerd, I always bring it back to soil health. And then when we have a diverse ecosystem, especially in our trees and understory plants, we can also have diverse soil biota and therefore healthy soils. Because like I said, I'm a soil nerd, so I always bring in this meme, but the soils really are the foundation of our forest ecosystem. So it's important that we're caring not only for the health of the trees and the plants, but also for the health of the soil. And so what this all breaks down into is many different paths and options that woodland stewards can take. And these adaptation strategies are not mutually exclusive. People can dabble in strategies across this adaptation spectrum, depending on what their goals are, what they want their forest to look like in the future. But of course, we want to make sure that folks are working with a local natural resource professional to help them make these very site-specific decisions based off of their own goals and objectives. So now I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of the methodology of how we actually created these 3 different lists for each of the ecoregions in Minnesota. So as I mentioned before, we use data from the Minnesota DNR and the USDA Tree Atlas. And we compiled all of the tree species from all of the forested native plant communities in Minnesota. So this is a lot of tree species. And then we put together this data, and this includes the response to a warmer climate, response to a wetter climate, and then the climate change capability for the 4.5 and 8.5 RCP scenarios. And so for each species, we averaged all of these different scores, and then we assigned each species a section level or ecoregion level capability rating. If that species received a score between 0 and 2.49, they were assigned a poor rating. And this moves them over into that refugia list. And we created this refugia list in the first place because we want to recognize that just because a species may not be predicted to do well with climate change, that doesn't mean that that species doesn't have inherent ecological and social value. So it's important that we help to protect and retain those species on the landscape. And this refugia category also includes species that have a critical forest health concern, such as emerald ash borer or butternut canker. So think population level threatening forest health concerns. And this is unfortunate because many of the ash species did pretty well, depending on the ecoregion, but many of those ash species did well. And so we had to move them over into the refugia category because even though they did well in terms of the climate change projections, they still have the critical forest health threat that is EAB. And then if species received a fair or a good rating, they got moved over into that climate capable list. So these are trees that we can count on to probably do pretty well in the future. So these are great options to continue managing far into the future with climate change. So now just to give a little bit more detail on the differences between these 2 lists. All of the tree species and climate capable and the refugia lists are native to their respective ecoregion. So these are all native tree species. For climate capable trees, again, these are good options to naturally regenerate, to plant, or to retain in their stands. And of course, trying to promote diversity, not just counting on in any single species, but trying to diversify our species mix. And then, of course, again, managing those species in consultation with a natural resource professional. For those refugia species, again, these are species that we want to try to protect and keep on the landscape because they may be vulnerable either due to climate vulnerability or because they are impacted by a critical forest health concern. So these are going to need slightly different management strategies in order to promote those species on the landscape compared to those climate capable trees. And again, helping improve the diversity in our stands, including in these refugia-focused management strategies. So now to give you an example of what these lists actually look like, here I am showing you the list from Ecoregion 2, the Northern Superior Uplands, so Northeast Minnesota. And again, so these lists are in draft form and they haven't been published, but this methodology is finalized, and we expect these lists to look pretty similar to what I'm showing you here now on the final website. So for these climate capable trees with the good or fair rating, it's a pretty familiar cast of characters when we're looking at this list. So we've got conifers and hardwoods, a lot of trees that are already really familiar to folks that they can continue managing, promoting diversity with many of these different tree species going forward into the future. So there's really no big curveballs here. We're just trying to provide this context of climate change to woodland stewards to help them make decisions about managing and adapting their woodland. And then when we think about refugia, and I'm going to show the refugia list on the next slide, but when we're talking about refugia, which I'm sure many of you understand this concept, but it's just the idea of trying to manage areas that can buffer the impacts of climate change in order to protect vulnerable species. And working with woodland stewards, we also talk about what sites could be good for refugia. I mentioned previously that really along the North Shore are great places for creating strongholds and climate refugia for different species just because of the ability of Lake Superior to buffer the impacts of climate change. North-facing slopes also stay cooler than south-facing slopes. This is another great option, as well as wetter sites that are less impacted by drought. And so understanding this context of refugia, so providing this narrative and the important content to go along with these lists. So for Ecoregion 2, there's a handful of species to consider for refugia for this ecoregion specifically. And again, these are species that had that poor rating or have a significant forest health concern. These are, again, familiar species, and it's sad and unfortunate to see the ash species on here, but we are trying to be proactive about thinking forward into the future about emerald ash borer and trying to manage proactively for future infestations. Balsam fir is on here because it had that poor rating, and I'm not sure many people in Northeast Minnesota, not a lot of people want a lot of balsam fir on their landscape anyway, just because of the fuel risk and because of spruce budworm. So that's not necessarily surprising to see that here. So I just talked a lot about trees with climate capable trees and those species to consider for refugia, but we also have those native understory plants. And the methodology for these plant lists is different than the tree lists. And that's because we don't have that robust climate data for understory plants. So we had to come up with something different to determine climate resilience. So we came up with a proxy methodology where we're looking at current range as a proxy for climate resilience. And essentially, this is where we're considering that if a species has a range that extends far to the east and to the south of Minnesota, we consider it to be climate resilient. And that's the best proxy that we came up with in the absence of robust climate data for these little understory plants. And then we also documented the diversity of those microfaunal benefits that these understory plants provide. So thinking about benefits for pollinators, birds, etc. And we also documented any other ecosystem services that these plants provide. Maybe that's like water retention and other ecosystem services, for example. And so here's an example of those climate ready plants. And here I'm only showing a subsection of those climate ready plants because there are a lot of plants in each of these lists. Because again, we compiled all of the native understory plants from all of the forested native plant communities in Minnesota. And a lot of these are climate resilient and do provide microfaunal benefits. So this results in very long lists, much longer than what I can provide here. But again, it's a familiar cast of characters. And in its final form, on our new website, we are going to be documenting and showing those microfaunal benefits so that woodland stewards can have that additional layer of information when they're making their adaptation decisions. And so now that I've summarized our methodology, really, our goal here is we want to provide a robust toolbox of climate adaptation options that woodland stewards can select from based off of their own goals and values. So we're not being prescriptive. We're just trying to provide the options and the educational foundation that people need in order to make these adaptation strategies, of course, in consultation with a local service provider that they're working with. And providing this robust toolbox of adaptation options is really important for woodland stewards because it provides them hope and agency. My colleague Angie Gupta does a lot of work related to eco-anxiety. And we've heard from people that have come to these presentations saying that they really struggle with eco-anxiety about climate change, that it really does impact them. And I think for woodland stewards, especially small acreage woodland stewards, it can be really easy to feel like they can't do anything for climate change. How are they supposed to care for their woodlands with this big overarching factor that is climate change? So we hope that through this Climate Ready Woodlands program, we're able to help them feel empowered by giving them hope and agency. And we have found in our evaluation results so far that 58% of Climate Ready Woodlands participants feel extremely concerned about climate change, that it's their top management priority. So this just highlights the need for empowerment to give them hope and agency. So we hope that by giving them this diverse and full toolbox of options, that they can feel a little bit better, a little bit anxious when it comes to climate change, that they know that they have options available to them to care for their woodlands in the face of climate change. And then as I start to move towards the end of this presentation, communicating uncertainty and risk is an important part of this program because, as I mentioned before, uncertainty and risk are inherent parts of a model-based approach. And of course, woodlands are complex and dynamic ecosystems. And so when we add in the additional complexity of climate change and changing disturbance regimes, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty going forward into the future. But the best approach is going to be one that incorporates multiple adaptation strategies. So we try to emphasize that folks shouldn't be putting all of their eggs in one basket and just trying one strategy. They should be experimenting and seeing what works. So trying to encourage this lifelong act of caretaking and experimenting on their woodlands, just so that they're not putting all of their eggs in one basket and just on one adaptation strategy. And then really, if they're thinking about planting and caring for any of these different species, the long-term survival of any of these species, whether it received an amazing rating on our methodology or is ranked as poor, the long-term survival of that species is really going to depend on the site. Because of course, if they're planting the wrong species on the wrong site, even if it's going to be climate adapted, doesn't mean it's going to grow there. If it's on the wrong site, of course, it's not going to be healthy and resilient. And so that's why it's really important to be making these site-specific decisions in conjunction with a local service provider that can help them sort through some of those complexities and nuance. So now as I start to wrap up, this program is expanding. My colleague Angie Gupta has recently launched a couple of participatory science projects for this program. And the goal of these participatory science projects is to identify the presence of any new to region migration potential species in Minnesota. So these are species that are not currently native to Minnesota, but may in the future be adapted to our climate. So she's using iNaturalist to have folks identify the presence of any of these species on the landscape, just so that we know, are they here and where are these species? She also has a different project where if people are currently managing any of these future climate adapted species, they can report back using a Google form to keep us updated on the health and performance of those specific species. So these are still a pretty new program or new projects, but I encourage you to check out the Z link here. And I'll also include Angie's contact info at the end so you can follow up with her with any more specific questions. And then we're also working with the Urban Forestry Lab at the University of Minnesota campus to implement experimental plantings of some of those future climate adapted species in a controlled setting. So the goal for this is just to determine the survival and performance of these future climate adapted species in a controlled environment down on the university campus, where they have people that can monitor them and report back on the long-term or short-term and long-term performance of these species. So these are two really exciting ways that the program is now expanding, kind of moving beyond just these lists and now moving into participatory science and experimental plantings with our partners at the U4 lab. And so with that, I just want to again acknowledge my project or my team members on for all of the work that they have done to make this program possible, Angie Gupta and Emily Dombeck, as well as all the reviewers that have been involved in this program and are still involved with reviewing these lists and making this entire program possible. And with that, here is all of our contact information, as well as a link to a feedback survey. I'd really appreciate any feedback that you have. We are always open to feedback from our collaborators and members of the public. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. That was terrific. We have a good number of questions for you here in the chat. Do you want to browse them? You want me to read them to you? We can do both. I can read.
You can read them. I've pulled them up, but you can.
You can see them also.
Yep.
All right. Let's start at the top. In comparison to other states, how advanced would you consider your program? Are you aware of other states? Are they at the same level? Are they doing similar kinds of stuff? And I'll add into this. I was thinking myself how I've worked on some of these issues myself of assisted migration, notions of rewilding, and man, when we were first writing about them, they were pretty darn controversial. And here you are talking about them with the public at large. That seems pretty ambitious and like you might be ahead of the game. Can you comment on that? How are you feeling, and what are you aware of going on in other states?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I'm gonna speak mainly in terms of other extension programs, and I also, I'm not aware of what's going on in every single state in terms of extension programs related to climate adaptation and recommendation lists like this. But me and my colleagues presented at an extension conference, a national extension conference with natural resource educators this spring. And just from the sense that I got there, it seemed like this program seems pretty novel in terms of what other states are doing. And of course, I think other states are implementing adaptation education in a lot of different ways that's different from what we're doing. But the way that we presented it here in terms of these recommendation lists for all the different ecoregions, I think is pretty unique. But also, I definitely don't have my finger on the pulse of every single state, so I don't want to misspeak, but I think it's relatively novel compared to other states. So,
well, maybe I could add on to that. If anyone does know or has something that they could share or contribute about what's going on, similar work that's going on in your state, I think we'd sure like to know about it. You might like to know about it also. So your email is there. I'll pop in our Midwest Cast email. We'd really love to hear about it. Maybe there's actually some collaboration we could build around this shared effort across multiple states. If that's all right with you, Anna?
Absolutely.
All right. How many foresters are there actually available to assist landowners with their specific planning? And is there any cost associated with that?
Yeah, so there are, I don't know the exact number, but there's a lot of different foresters that are available to help woodland stewards across Minnesota from different agencies. So those could be DNR, private forest management foresters. There's consulting foresters. There's foresters through the soil and water conservation districts or the Natural Resource Conservation Service. And so all of those programs are going to have different associated costs, but many of them also offer great resources like cost share, for example. And so those folks are available to help with that specific site planning. And so there's different options through different agencies.
Great. Okay. Allie says, the Midwest is really fragmented. So working with sort of individual stewards of pieces of land, how do you coordinate them all to get some landscape level adaptation possibilities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in its current state right now, in the Climate Ready Woodlands program, we're not currently addressing that. That's something we would like to do. But I would say that's more something that the Minnesota Forest Climate Working Group is trying to achieve, is thinking about this interagency, cohesive landscape level adaptation. We're trying to work towards we're in the very early stages, but we have this idea of all lands assisted migration guidance. So this is obviously all the way over onto the right side of that climate adaptation spectrum, thinking specifically about assisted migration, but trying to provide that guidance for across the landscape and across agencies and ownerships. And so if you're interested in anything related to that effort, I'd definitely feel free to give me an email and I can loop you in on those communications.
All right, we have questions from, actually, there's a kind of similar, lots of people want to know who else is doing this in other places. Jenny and Sadie are both asking about extrapolating to other landscapes, whether it be Wisconsin woodlands. If you have any thoughts about, I don't suppose, whether the ecology would be there or any way in which forest management takes place that would make it different, I would think it would be similar. And then another question is, for example, looking at different biomes, like in the driftless where forests are next to prairie and wetlands, different combinations of forest biomes. What would you have to say about extrapolation from what you're doing to other geographies?
Yeah, so related to if this can be extrapolated to like northern Wisconsin, for example, I would say that the methodology could definitely be applied there. The specific lists for Minnesota probably wouldn't be applicable to Wisconsin just because the input data would be different. But since the USDA Tree Atlas, covers all of the eastern US, that I think the methodology could definitely be applied here or could be applied in Wisconsin. And in terms of looking at other biomes, especially prairies, that's a question that we've gotten before. And I think that that would be definitely a goal for the future. It's difficult because we're tree people and forestry people. And so we don't have like a, prairie expert on the team. But with the plant list, when we get more to the western part of the state, that includes a lot of those native grasses. But in terms of management recommendations for more of those transitional areas. We haven't developed those, but I can definitely see that being a direction that this program could go in the future.
Great. Hey, Andrew, are you available to ask your question yourself? I think I understand it, but I bet you could vocalize it better than me about how there are multiple hardiness zones across the state. And so are there specific recommendations for the different hardiness zones?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously it's a lot colder in northern Minnesota than it is in southern Minnesota. And so for the southeast corner of the state in those hardwoods, you could get tulip trees starting to come in, but you're not going to want to plant that up near International Falls where you can plant other hardwoods. How do you address this possibility for landowners who may not necessarily have the background to understand the breadth of opportunities for trees across the state?
Yeah, great question. So I guess the first thing I want to say is that for those climate capable trees and then the refugia lists, all of those trees are already native to that respective ecoregion. I would say so if you're on the website right now, you might see that some of the lists include species like tulip tree, more of those migration potential lists. But we decided to step away from including those like new to Minnesota species on the actual recommendation list themselves, just because we recognize the high level of complexity and nuance when it comes to recommending these assisted migration strategies, especially thinking about the different planting zones. And I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I guess my main point would be that all the tree recommendations, those are already native to their ecoregion. And if people are interested in planting like a more southernly seed stock of, for example, white pine in northern Minnesota, I think that's currently beyond the scope of this project, and they would probably need to work with a local service provider on that. But that's something that we definitely have talked to our partners about and could be a potential area of expansion in the future. So hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, Andrew, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well, it also makes me think, if I could add on top of it too, I mean, implicit in these lists and talking about climate adaptation is how much the climate is going to change and over what time horizon, right? And many of these are very long-lived trees. So it's not necessarily easy to make specific recommendations about which trees should go where and how many, zones one should jump.
absolutely.
And I think you said that very early on, the context matters, the
Yeah,
goal matters, the intent of the steward, I would think matters as well.
absolutely.
Erin Williams, would you be willing to ask your question too? Because I think there's more to it here than maybe is typed in the chat window about this community
Sure.
gravel bed work.
Sure. Yeah, I was just curious about, your work really is looking at the climate readiness piece of this. And Gary Johnson's work, now retired, but some of it's continued, has looked at this idea of the gravel beds and what over summers really well in a community gravel bed, and then that is outplanted in the fall when water availability is better for these kind of tree species. And so I'm wondering if there's sort of a crosswalk between your work and, what tree species might do well in a gravel bed, and then that outplanting component of it, or if that's an opportunity to look at kind of that crosswalk.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that work from Gary predates my time at Extension. And so I'm not really familiar with it. But if it was Angie or Emily here, they'd probably be able to actually answer this question. But we haven't cross-pollinated with that work at all to this point, as far as I'm aware. But we have been more closely collaborating with the U4 lab in recent months, and so I think this is a resource that we could probably refer back to and see if it would be relevant at this point to help inform this new program. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a great answer because
No worries.
I'm not super aware of that
No
resource.
worries,
So
but I'd love to follow up with you guys on that.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
thanks.
That would be amazing. Follow up. Yay. Um, Sadie, we're on a roll of people vocalizing their own questions. You want to ask about your signage and public facing stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So I had the great opportunity to do some behavior change work in the last couple of years, and we talked a lot about signage both impacting participants' commitment to, whatever program they want to be a part of, and also the spread of that with at least smart salting. Have you noticed anything like that as well?
Yeah, so I think your question is awesome, and that's something we would love to do, but we haven't gotten there yet. And I've been thinking about this for other programs like the Minnesota Woodland Steward program as well. Um, so currently, like we don't have any like yard signs or stickers or things that can kind of provide that nudge for folks to participate and remain committed to the program. But we would really like to do that. We just haven't gotten there yet. And my colleague Emily Dombeck is something that I think that's something that she would love to implement. But yeah, I would love to talk to you more like offline about that because we haven't gotten to that point yet, but that's a goal.
Everyone likes stickers. Really
Yes.
can't go wrong with stickers.
Yeah.
But she then, Sadie, you went on to ask, how do people know about this?
Oh,
And yeah, you want to ask that as well while you have the floor?
Sorry, I was trying to type in my email for you. Yeah, so I'm curious to know how people find out about the program. If there's a way that you find out how people find out, did they just go through the website? Is it while they're, Googling for resources? Did they hear about it from a neighbor, things like that?
yeah. So I think, and I haven't looked at like the analytics data for our website recently, but my understanding is that a lot of people find information through Googling and then they end up on the extension website and at our resource. But also we really lean into our networks. So sending it out through not only the Extension Forestry newsletter, but also leaning into our collaborators like through the Soil and Water Conservation Districts, the DNR, the Minnesota Forestry Association. So just using our partners to help spread the word. And we, both Angie and I, have been giving a lot of talks throughout the state for the last year. And I think so word of mouth has probably helped to spread the word. But mainly just right now, focusing on building and maintaining those networks.
Great. Let's do one more, and then I think I need to turn it back to Jess for okay, I lost track here. Jenny Hoffman, do you have a comment or question? You want to turn that into a question or vocalize that?
Yeah, I can just vocalize. I thought this was really exciting. Because I'm familiar with the tree atlas work that's just the trees. And I'm working on a project now that's doing trees, shrubs, and annuals, trying to provide advice to people doing restoration work in the Mid-Atlantic. And so we've actually been developing a more in-depth vulnerability assessment approach for the species not covered by the tree atlas. So I was really interested to hear what you did. So mostly, yeah, mostly it's just, I think it's really exciting that you're looking at communities, because that's one of the things we've been struggling with in our project is, and this is again where extension is just so awesome, connecting people to the resources, trying to figure out how to separately address the question of here's the climate resilience information versus here's how to make a thoughtful planting decision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I guess the only question there would be, do you have insight specifically on how non-extension agencies can provide, here's our climate smart plant lists, while simultaneously telling people don't just plant things that are on this list, because you have to think about watering and the soil types and all these other local conditions.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think maybe your question is kind of like a train the trainer type of question in terms of how we provide education on climate adaptation to those local service providers to help them inform woodland stewards. And that's also something we haven't quite fully gotten to yet with this program. But I mean, the foresters working with Woodland Stewards of Minnesota are great, and I think they definitely have the resources available to them, not only through Extension, but also through NIAX. I think that there's a lot of resources out there available to help people make those decisions. Like the adaptation workbook is something I refer to a lot. And again, I don't know if that answered your question, but
No, it's great. It's all,
yeah,
yeah, I just love this project. Thank you so much
yeah,
for the presentation and the work.
thank you.
Yeah, always shout out to NIAX, right? They do great work also. I just want to make sure everybody sees as I hand this back to Jess. So Jamie Strange says forestry for Minnesota birds would love to help spread the word.
Okay.
And Ann Calhoun points to 2 field guides in Wisconsin, climate change for southern Wisconsin and northern Wisconsin forests. So everyone please check out those links. With those guides, we used similar methodology to what Anna shared and would love to expand in a future edition. And if anyone wants to reach out to Anne, there is her email right there in the chat window. Wow, well, that was great. Lots of really good questions. Thank you, Anne, for that contact there at the end and helping us extend to Wisconsin. Thank you, Anna. Jess, I want to turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you both. Thank you, Anna, so much for a great presentation. Lots of great connections in the chat. I know I personally just exported this to my desktop to save it. And we will be sending out an email with the recording of this seminar and re-upping Anna's email as well for anyone who wants to follow up with her individually. As always, we would love to get your feedback on how we did today. So I've got a quick poll that we would appreciate you filling out before you hop off the call. We are also busy setting up the next year of our seminar programming. So if you have ideas on people you'd like to see on a future seminar or topics you are interested in, let us know via this poll or shoot us an email because we're always looking for new ideas. Thanks so much again, Anna, and everybody else on the call for spending your Monday lunch hour with us today. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you when we return in September for our fall seminar series. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.